The duality of AAA game publishers. On one hand, you've got those who give in to misguided temptations when it comes to like turning franchises that are traditionally single player and trying to make them online multiplayer. And then you've got a AAA publisher who like tried that early on, but were very quickly like, no, this is not what the fans want. Let's not ruin this franchise. The former refers to Electronic Arts, a game publisher that has become very controversial because of their just incessant need to commit to live services. And despite knowing how unfavorable many of their practices are as far as monetization is concerned, they just double down on that stuff because they know people will pay, or enough people will engage with it, and they'll be able to extract as much money as possible. And then you've got something like Capcom. This is a company that's been on a roll with banger after banger when it comes to game releases. And Resident Evil has been a franchise that they've kind of revived in a really strong way with the remakes and with the new entries and the direction that they've taken Resident Evil. And today's story concerns Resident Evil 9 and how it contrasts the development of Dragon Age: The Veilguard. So one thing that you may not know about Resident Evil 9 is that once upon a time it was going to be a very different game. Back in May of 2025, Aesthetic Gamer, aka Dusk Golem, who is an industry insider who's got sources, who's leaked a lot of information about upcoming horror games, talked about how once upon a time, Resident Evil 9 was going to be an open world game, an open world multiplayer game at that. Here's what he said. A lot of what he shared about an old scrap version of Resident Evil 9, referring to another source, the Native American Wendigo, he's called. So he kind of elaborated on what he shared. Resident Evil 9 originally started development back in 2017. The original version of Resident Evil 9 was trying to be the opposite of Resident Evil 7 because when Resident Evil 7 first launched, it actually underperformed. And so basically Capcom saw that Resident Evil 7 was initially underperforming. They panicked and like, well, clearly we got to like pivot and make this an open world multiplayer game. So the original version of RE9 was trying to be the opposite of RE7, i.e. big open world multiplayer game. RE9 originally starred Leon and Jill in a fictional island based off of Singapore. This is the old RE9. The project got a pretty heavy reboot in 2021 around the time Village came out. Now, this is all ultimately rumor and speculation, but Dusk Golem has been proven to be a pretty reliable source of leaks, and the information that he put out there was actually recently confirmed by the developers themselves, who admitted that early on, Resident Evil 9 was going to be an open-world multiplayer game. So right here we have the creator's message #1 video from the Resident Evil portal, and skipping to a certain section, we've got the following information that they shared. Hell yes, as it should be.
要素を詰め込むってことはできたと思いますし、実際我々もこのタイトルのごく初期ではいろんなシステムの検討っていうのを行ったんですけれども、よく噂されてますけど、オンラインのバイオハザードですとか、オープンワールド、They straight up acknowledged the rumors and the leaks. And there it is, there's footage of this. They actually were very upfront, which I appreciate. Yes. Thank you. Can you imagine a world where Resident Evil 9 turned out to be an online multiplayer game, especially in a landscape where people are kind of getting tired, especially when single player or traditionally single player developers or traditionally single player franchises try to pursue this route that doesn't necessarily fit the IP in the way that people like really love it. It's like one thing for it to be a spin-off, but to make a mainline Resident Evil entry, an online open world multiplayer game, it's just something that never was going to go well. It was going to be a live service main entry for Resident Evil, which is not what people want at all. The temptation was there, but they assessed the situation. They stopped themselves in their tracks. Resident Evil 7 eventually did sell well enough where it gave them some confidence that this was the right direction for Resident Evil. And they went, let's scrap this altogether. This is not what the fans want. Let's give Resident Evil fans what they would actually look forward to. A single-player, offline horror experience, survival horror experience with all of the markings that make a Resident Evil game, including the absurd moments. And this is a pivot that I appreciate, and it's seemingly a pivot that happened smoothly enough where they could actually like start from scratch, is what they said, to create Resident Evil 9 Requiem. And I bring this up because it's in stark contrast to what Electronic Arts did with Dragon Age. Dragon Age: The Veilguard in particular. This is a game that many will know initially started as a single-player game, but then EA demanded that it be turned into a live service. It's why veteran creative heads of the Dragon Age series left around that time. They just didn't believe in that direction for the game. And so for a while, Dragon Age: The Veilguard was actually developed as a multiplayer online live service experience. But eventually, EA did make the pivot to bring it back to what it was originally supposed to be, single player. But the difference here is that Dragon Age went too far in that route as a multiplayer game, and EA didn't give the team enough time to build this game from scratch. So they had to take components of this multiplayer game that they were building and adapt it into a single player experience. It's why the tone is lighter. That tone was more meant for a live service experience that was meant to have more mass appeal. It's why the combat is the way it is. It's why the gameplay and the structure of the game and the game design just doesn't quite align with something like, Dragon Age Origins and past Dragon Age entries. It's because it inherited a lot of the multiplayer stuff that kind of ended up crippling the single player experience, and it ended up having to adapt elements that you wouldn't associate with Dragon Age. And that's why a lot of people felt like, while Dragon Age: The Veilguard, it's a miracle that it shipped in a polished state and as a cohesive game at all. People felt like it just didn't quite feel like the Dragon Age we know and love, and it's because it had to inherit a lot of the once multiplayer project to be able to be finished within the time frame that EA restricted them to. But with Resident Evil 9 Requiem, they experimented with multiplayer. At first, it started as a multiplayer project because it was this knee-jerk reaction to Resident Evil 7 not selling as well initially, and then again it had this long tail. But initially there was the thought process of, what if we just go live service with Resident Evil 9 essentially, and that would have just ruined not only the reputation of Resident Evil and Capcom, or at least done significant damage to it. It would have, I think, been woefully detrimental to Resident Evil 9 as an entry, as a mainline entry to the series. And so the fact that Capcom and the folks and the leadership gave the go-ahead to scrap that, there could have been the temptation to just force them to continue this project and to make it multiplayer and to make it heavily monetized, which, that's what online multiplayer games do these days. It would have been a monetized live service. I have little doubt about that. But the fact that they actually decided to pivot and say, this is not it, Chief. This is not what the fans want, and we need to build this project from scratch and make it the experience that it should be at launch. And it's not going to inherit aspects of that multiplayer game. I'm sure, I don't know, there might be some assets that they inherited and whatnot, but it would seem as though they were given enough time, especially with Village acting as a stopgap before 9, to really make this single player Resident Evil 9 from the ground up, and not having to be restricted by having to inherit aspects of the online multiplayer game. And they were able to make an experience that feels like it was tailor-made to be an offline single-player game. And this is emphasized in the creator's message. They make it a point to highlight that it's a single-player offline game. They really want to emphasize that. And so yeah, people online are basically expressing that Resident Evil fans dodged a bullet, or rather Capcom dodged a bullet, by not making it an online game. Capcom is on such a roll right now with Resident Evil in particular, and for them to ruin that by kind of giving into the temptation of going in the most generic route possible you could go with this IP, instead of really reinforcing and committing to the identity of Resident Evil and what makes it special and what fans love about it. Yeah, I mean, I'd say that to say that they dodged a bullet is an understatement. I think they dodged a missile here. And with Resident Evil 9 not being a live service, they don't have to maintain servers. They don't have to rely on recurrent monetization. They can just rely on this game being a good-ass product that they just put out into the world. It can just be a basic transaction between company and customer, and with what they've shown so far and the amount of hype that Requiem has received, I have little doubt that it'll go on to sell really well, and that this will be a much more financially sound product, and this will be much more commercially successful, and it will make the money in a way that I think a live service version of this would have flopped and would have cost them a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of manpower, and a lot of goodwill. So yeah, I applaud Capcom for having the sense to pivot when they needed to, when that temptation set in, to go the route that every other game publisher is going at, because they all want a piece of the pie of this oversaturated market in the hopes that they win the lottery of being able to turn a live service game into a billion-dollar franchise or whatever like that. That is not the route to go, especially with an established IP that isn't that at all. EA, I mean, what they did with Dragon Age the Veilguard, the way they handle that project, the way they try to make it a live service multiplayer game, and then the constant shifts in the direction of that project, and then not giving developers enough time to be able to make a true single-player Dragon Age from scratch where they could not be restricted by old design choices because of what this project was originally going to be, a live service that makes no sense for Dragon Age, an IP that is just not that at all. Like, how much that fucked them, like, that is just such an opposite story to Resident Evil 9 here, where the pivot happened early enough and where developers were given enough time to just make a Resident Evil game, not a live service with a Resident Evil coat of paint. In the same way that EA should have done with Dragon Age the Veilguard, a proper single-player Dragon Age game instead of something that ultimately was an amalgam of design choices in the past that didn't quite mesh with what the identity of Dragon Age is. Or at the very least, this is one man's take on this news that Resident Evil 9 was once supposed to be an online multiplayer open world game, and that the creators actually, the developers came out and admitted it, and like actually were very upfront and honest about that development cycle, and how they felt like, you know, ultimately the fans and what they want needs to be a priority for an IP that has a very specific identity. I just appreciate that their candor about all this and the decisions that they ultimately made. But that's my take. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.